Where is your regiment? Fighting desperately on the top of the hill, sir, where you placed it. Why, I sent you orders to retire in good order. I never received them, sir, and I'm sorry I'm too seriously wounded to take them off, for they are suffering dreadfully. The whole matter was a blunder. There was no directing hand in our retreat. All of it, at one time, assumed the appearance of a rout. And the same men who had marched near 500 miles in Virginia and Maryland in rags, on insufficient food, and many of them without a shoe to their feet. These same men sternly moved through thunder and slaughter to the last death clinch. The roar of the pieces and the howl and explosion of shells was awful. Sometimes a shell burst right in the ranks, tearing and mangling all around it. In Pender's brigade, I saw a man lifted clear into the air, but all in vain. The men closed in at once, and the advance was continued without a falter. I remember seeing the river full of men, while our men lay on top of the bluff and poured volley after volley into the enemy, every man who was shot going down to his death in the river, either by the shot or by drowning. The first announcement was that the enemy had taken the heights and captured all of the guns. All, said the general? Yes, General, I fear all. This announcement lifted me right off my blanket, and I moved away. Thomas A. McGrath is the author of Shepherdstown, Last Clash of the Antietam Campaign, September 19/20, 1862. A key blunder by an artillery commander shuts down General Robert E. Lee's historic war plan in 1862 to successfully take the Civil War into Maryland, and meant to dissuade American voters in the November elections from supporting the federal war effort, and to convince England's pondering leaders to recognize the Confederacy. It almost worked. McGrath explains what happened.
In early September of 1862, General Robert E. Lee moved his Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River into Maryland. He had several objectives. He hoped to move the war on Virginia, gather supplies, bolster his army with new recruits, damage Northern morale, and possibly a victory on Northern soil might convince European powers to officially recognize the Confederacy. He would remain in Maryland for 2 weeks and engage the enemy on 3 separate occasions: South Mountain, Harper's Ferry, and of course the bloody battle at Antietam on September 17th. On the evening of September 18th, Lee decided to abandon his position at Sharpsburg and move his army back into Virginia. This was not a retreat, however. The campaign was ongoing. He told Jefferson Davis that he did not want to hold his position at Antietam because it was a bad one to hold with the river at his rear. He wanted to recross here, a mile below Shepherdstown, move upriver, cross at Williamsport, and move on Hagerstown, Maryland.
All night between the 18th and Friday the 19th, the Confederate Army slipped away from the battlefield across open fields in Maryland and across the Potomac River into Virginia at the Shepherdstown Ford. Some of the Confederate artillery was set up as a rearguard measure on the Virginia bluffs just south of Shepherdstown. One of the men, J.B. Moore, wrote later, "Just about sunrise, General Longstreet rode up and ordered me to take 2 guns to shell a point of woods on the other side of the river, where he said the enemy were massing. Like the poor innocent that I was, I took the guns and left the chicken. and when my duty with the guns was over, I returned to find both General Longstreet and my chicken gone. He left orders, however, that we were to remain on the bluff as long as possible, and when driven away by larger and longer range guns, to retire as quickly as possible upon the rear of the army. With the exception of the odor of fried chicken and 2 peaches that I had found on a tree near the battery, I had nothing to eat all that day.
On the morning of September 19th, the Union Army awoke to find the Confederate lines abandoned. Cavalry pickets were sent toward the river, where they caught the last of Lee's army retreating here at the ford. Confederate artillery opened up from the heights above the crossing.
I observed an officer and an orderly riding down the hill towards the barn and the house near Blackford's Ford, and having cut the fuse and being just about to give the order to fire, I concluded to try a shot at these men instead of at the barn. So, moving the trail slightly to the left and giving the gun a very slight elevation, I was delighted to see, upon the explosion of the shrapnel, that both men had been knocked from their horses to the ground. One of them was evidently killed, the other badly wounded, but after about half an hour he succeeded in getting his horse, and with the assistance of the rail fence, he rode to the rear.
Union artillery unlimbered and fired in response. This exchange marked the beginning of the 2-day Battle of Shepherdstown.
From what occurred afterwards, I am satisfied that these men came with orders for the men hidden in the barn, house, and bed of the canal to charge across the river at a given signal, because just about that time a battery of 20-pound Parrotts, which we had observed for an hour or two on the extreme left of the battery's line, commenced firing. And though the distance was estimated to be about 2.5 miles, their shots fell within a few feet of our guns, though none of them exploded where they struck, but ricocheted over our heads to where General Pryor's infantry was lying in the woods. Our guns, being smoothbore, could not, of course, fight a battery of 20-pound Parrotts, so we withdrew just below the brow of the hill and awaited further orders. McGrath continues.
Defending the river crossing was a rear guard commanded by William Nelson Pendleton. He had at his disposal 2 small brigades of infantry and 44 guns of the artillery reserve, 33 of which were placed on the heights overlooking the ford. Throughout the morning and afternoon of September 19th, Union troops of the 5th Corps, under General Fitzjohn Porter, took up positions along the Maryland Heights and in the dry C&O Canal bed. From here they kept up a concentrated artillery and infantry barrage against the Confederate position, driving many of the rebel gunners from their guns. Toward late afternoon, Porter sensed an opportunity, and he ordered an assault on the Confederate position. At dusk, 2 regiments, the 1st United States Sharpshooters and the 4th Michigan, crossed the river under fire. They scaled the bluffs on the Virginia side, scattering what was left of the Confederate defense, capturing 4 cannon and several prisoners. After dark, these men withdrawn back to the Maryland side, and the fighting for the day was over.
Upon the withdrawal of our guns, the firing of this battery ceased, and being very tired, to say nothing about being sleepy and hungry, I stretched myself on the ground and went to sleep. How long I slept I have no idea, but was awakened by a most tremendous fire of artillery all along the line of the hill on the north bank of the river, and noticed particularly that our friends of the 20-pound Parrotts had the range of the top of our hill in the most uncomfortable manner. As I rose to my feet, I found the whole woods on the other side ablaze with a fire of heavy guns, ranging from 3-inch rifles to 24-pound howitzers, probably some 25 guns altogether. How many infantry were in the bed of the river and crossing the canal, it could be hard to tell, but from my frightened condition, I thought there were 1,000,000 of them. The river was full of men over halfway across, cheering and firing as it came on. The men of our battery, together with those belonging to other batteries on the bluff, were mixed up in helter-skelter race for the road. The whole field and road being crowded with men, guns, horses, limber chests without the guns, caissons, officers on horseback and on foot, all in a confused mass, and all making the best time possible to where they expected to find the rear of General Lee's army.
This day's actions would have tremendous consequences, however, ultimately altering Lee's plans for his campaign. Just after midnight, he received word that the Yankees had crossed the river, and he also received the false report that all 44 guns of his artillery reserve had been taken.
Wrote a staff officer of General Lee, who was in the camp that night. About 1 o'clock in the night, the officer commanding the passage over the river rode up, asked for the general, dismounted, and entered into conversation. The first announcement was that the enemy had taken the heights and captured all of the guns. "All?" said the general. "Yes, General, I fear all." This announcement lifted me right off my blanket, and I moved away, fearful I might betray my feelings. The general exhibited no temper, made no reproach that I could hear either then or even afterwards when he learned that the gallantry of a subordinate officer had saved the command, and that the commanding officer had been premature in his report. This would have been an extraordinary instance of forbearance.
The march to Williamsport was halted. 3 divisions would be sent back to Shepherdstown.
J.F.J. Caldwell wrote later how A.P. Hill's men returned to Shepherdstown Ford to defend against a Federal advance. Very early on the morning of September 20th, the Light Division was sent back towards the Potomac to break up the undertaking of McClellan's to gain a foothold on Virginia soil. For this purpose, we were formed in 2 lines facing Boulter's Ford and rather more than half a mile from it.
With the Union success on September 19th, General George McClellan ordered a reconnaissance in force for the morning of the 20th. At around 7 o'clock in the morning, Major Charles Lovell, with just over 1,000 regular soldiers, crossed the Potomac here at Shepherdstown Ford, proceeded up Trough Road. This reconnaissance was supposed to be preceded by a screen of cavalry, however, which had yet to arrive. And as a result, Lovell was now marching into the countryside blind. About a mile into the march, the head of Lovell's column emerged on this plateau. Ahead of him, in a stand of timber in a cornfield, he would see movement. This was A.P. Hill's division, which had just arrived on the field and were now deploying into line of battle. Lovell halted his men and deployed them into line, in column by battalion. He then sent word back to his supervisor, George Sykes, who was then at the ford. Sykes would send back the word to suspend the march into Virginia and to withdraw back to the river. As of yet, not a shot had been fired. Meanwhile, back at the ford, General George Sykes was supervising the crossing of a 2nd Union Brigade. This one was under the command of Colonel James Barnes, whose mission was to proceed to Shepherdstown. With this news that the enemy had been encountered, however, Sykes countermanded that order and ordered James Barnes to occupy the heights above the cement mill, so as to cover Lovell's flank as he withdrew. Barnes soon complied and began deploying his men up 2 ravines to reach the top of the heights. After the withdrawal of Lovell, 3 Confederate brigades stepped out from the woods and the cornfield. These were the brigades of Pender, Gregg, and Thomas. As they moved across the fields behind me, skirmish fire broke out. Suddenly, the guns from across the river on the Maryland Heights erupted in a thunderous crash, turning the ground behind me into a killing field. One regiment in particular, 14th South Carolina, who was advancing just on the other side of Trough Road, would lose 55 men in probably a span of 15 or 20 minutes. The terrain of this field greatly affected the Confederate advance. Trough Road, which begins on a high-level plateau, drops precipitously down to the river, where it becomes almost a ravine or a chasm. It was this divide that split the Confederate line, leaving Pender's brigade isolated on the left. Watching from the rear, General A.P. Hill ordered his next line of 3 brigades, Archer, Lane, and Brockenbrough, under the direct command of General James Archer, to advance to Pender's support. Meanwhile, on the fields above the cement mill, Pender was engaged in a firefight with Barnes's brigade. He began receiving heavy fire from his right front from the men of the 18th Massachusetts who were posted on the crest of the hill. When the 13th and 25th New York appeared on Pender's left, the Confederate commander thought he was about to be flanked, and he sent back word for reinforcements on that side. As General James Archer advanced across the fields behind me, he was moving through a hail of shot and shell. In these fields of the Osborne farm, he would lose 136 men. 17 would be killed, 119 wounded, many mortally.
Wrote Caldwell of Gregg's Confederate Brigade, the rifles were sent forward as skirmishers. Our advance was first through a thick cornfield of about 200 yards breadth, and then across a smooth open field, a little undulating. We were all the time under the guns of the enemy, although they did not open heavily upon us until we cleared that cornfield. Then their fire was terrific. First their shot and shell, afterwards their canisters seemed to sweep the whole surface of the earth. Yet the advance was beautifully executed. The same men who had marched nearly 500 miles in Virginia and Maryland in rags, on insufficient food, and many of them without a shoe to their feet, these same men turned upon them, unconfused by moral appearances, unterrified by the formidable array of artillery and infantry, and sternly moved through the thunder and slaughter to the last death clinch. The roar of the pieces and the howl of the explosion of shells was awful. Sometimes a shell burst right in the ranks, tearing and mangling all around it. In Pender's brigade, I saw a man lifted clear into the air, but all in vain. The men closed in at once, and the advance was continued without a falter.
On the east side of Trough Road, Lovell's brigade took up a position along the ridge bordering the river. To their left, the brigade of Governor K. Warren extended their line and began firing into the brigades of Thomas and Gregg. It was at this point when General Porter could see that the reconnaissance of that morning had begun to escalate into a vicious firefight, and he gave orders for all of his units to disengage and withdraw back to Maryland. Lovell and Warren on the right were the first to receive the orders. They complied, crossing under fire at the ford. Colonel James Barnes next received word, and his units began to descend the bluffs. Most of them crossed either at the dam or swam to safety. But on the Federal right, there was something that looked out of place. Something had gone wrong. There was one Federal regiment that remained in position on top of the bluffs. This unit was the 118th Pennsylvania Volunteers. The 118th Pennsylvania was a brand new regiment. They had been in the Army less than a month. When they received the order to withdraw, their commander, Colonel Charles Prevost, refused to obey because he thought it didn't come through proper channels, and it was a fatal mistake. They were soon left alone on the top of these bluffs.
How the orders were mishandled was written about many years later by the regiment's historian. After Colonel Prevost had passed through the ravine, he met Colonel Barnes on the road by the river. To prevent mistakes, Colonel Barnes was following up the orderly whom he had directed to carry the orders to retire. It was a fatal interval between the attempt to prevent mistakes and what had been a most grievous one. "Where is your regiment?" Colonel Barnes earnestly inquired. "Fighting desperately on the top of the hill, sir, where you placed it," was the colonel's response. "Why, I sent you orders to retire in good order." "I never received them, sir, and I'm sorry I'm too seriously wounded to take them off, for they are suffering dreadfully." McGrath continues.
A short time into the fight, the men realized that many of their muskets were not firing. They were defective, and these men were so new to the Army they had not even fired their weapons.
In the early years of the Civil War, there were many export pieces brought in. Both sides did it. The federal government brought in Enfields from England. They brought in German pieces. They brought in Belgian pieces. The Confederate government did the same through the blockade. They were trying to get as many pieces of muzzleloading equipment in here to fight the war as possible. And what ended up happening, to be kind, is to say that Europe sort of cleaned out all of her arsenals of the leftovers, and we got them. And when we got them, as I say, some of them were in good working order, some of them were excellent pieces, but then there were those that had problems and were defective. A story that I want to relay to you as far as Jefferson County goes is in the Battle of the Cement Mills at Shepherdstown. The 118th Pennsylvania Corn Exchange Regiment, a brand new federal regiment, had been issued Enfield rifled muskets, Model 53. And when those guys crossed the Potomac River to assault the Confederate flank, actually none of them had ever loaded and fired their guns. They were issued these contractor pieces that had been brought over, and hadn't really been inspected. What happened was that they knew how to drill with the guns, they knew how to move them around their bodies and how to fix bayonets and do all the other parts that were important. But when they went to load and fire them, some of them recorded that the gun would not fire, or that when they pulled the trigger, the hammer, that's this piece, would fall down and crush the cone. Now, what I did not tell you is that I am a professional blacksmith. So if anybody knows metal in this world, it's probably me. And I can tell you that this gun has a piece called a mainspring. The mainspring is the piece that throws the hammer backwards and the one that you cock to get it forward. When making a spring in a forge, first you shape the piece, and then that spring has to have enough hardness so that it will open and close, open and close. Typically you temper a spring, that is, you just soften it enough so that when you pull the trigger, it does what it needs to do. It advances the hammer, and it either pops the cap or it strikes the flint. If the spring is not tempered, and if it is too hard, it will crack. Or worse, if it is overheated, it's too soft or mushy, and it won't fire at all. From the accounts of the 118th Pennsylvania in 1862, they talked about how they pulled the triggers and the hammers either would not pull or they crushed the cone. That tells me that the springs were overly hardened and not tempered. And it also tells me that what happened was that some of those springs were broken inside the lock that we discussed earlier. They didn't know that, and because of that they took a high casualty rate.
At one point, Colonel Charles Prevost grabbed the regimental colors and charged forward to steady the line. He took a bullet to his body and was knocked out of the fight. Eventually, 4 Confederate brigades converged on the 118th, drove it back, and sent the men into a panicked retreat. Most of the men of the 118th Pennsylvania tried to make their escape down through this ravine. This is actually the way they had come into the fight. But during the Federal artillery bombardment, a tree had been knocked over, blocking their path. Confederates from above fired down into this tight mass of blue men. Some of the men of the 118th Pennsylvania sought shelter in these brick kilns. At one point, a Federal shell fell short, exploding in one of them, killing 3 men and mortally wounding several others.
William Tilton of the 22nd Massachusetts Infantry wrote his wife of the battle, "The whole matter was a blunder. There was no directing hand, and our retreat all at once assumed the appearance of a rout." Wrote J.B. Moore, "As the Yankees began to give way and to rush down the sides of the ravine of the road and thence into the river, the fire of Hill's infantry became steadier and their aim truer, and how many were killed no one knows. The ravine was narrow and full of men, every man for himself in a mad effort to cross the river before the rebels could overtake them. I remember seeing the river full of men, as I recall now, not firing a single gun, while our men lay on the top of the bluff and poured volley after volley into the enemy, every man who was shot going down to his death in the river, either by the shot or by drowning. It was one of the horrible sights of the war." McGrath writes, "As the number of men fleeing across the dam tapered off, and the rifle fire slackened considerably, there occurred one of the saddest incidents of the disastrous day. Appearing suddenly on the Virginia shore was a handsome, soldierly young man named Rudolph White. White, who was only 20 years old, had escaped from the fight unharmed, making his way across the treacherous dam, now strewn with bodies of dead and wounded. Upon reaching the Maryland shore, he stood onto the riverbank, breathed a great sigh of relief, and exclaimed, 'Thank God, I'm over at last!' Just as the words left his mouth, a shot rang out from the opposite shore, and Ruddy White doubled over, shot through the bowels. Within seconds, the young soldier who had been beloved by both officers and men was dead." First Lieutenant Lemuel Crocker of the 118th ignored denied permissions to retrieve wounded comrades from the Virginia side, but he scrambled up the steep banks of the canal on the Maryland side and moved towards the river. Alone, he traversed the dam, all the time under the peering rifle sights of rebel pickets on the opposite banks. And while on the Virginia side, he recovered the bodies of Cortlandt Saunders, Joseph Ricketts, and Mara Moss, as well as a wounded private. One by one, the large man hoisted the bodies over his left shoulder and carried them to the river's edge. He had carried the bodies over his left shoulder and was absolutely covered with blood and dirt, almost unrecognizable as a soldier, and his voice and form alone indicated his manhood. Crocker was then confronted by a Confederate officer and his staff while on top of the bluffs. The officer, whom Crocker believed was a general, informed him that there had been no flag of truce and asked by whose order he had crossed the river. Crocker's reply was prompt and ingenuous. He had been refused permission to cross by his corps commander, to whom he had made his purpose known. "The dead and wounded of the regiment that fought on that ground yesterday were of the blood of Philadelphia's best citizens," he said, "and regardless of the laws of war and the commands of his superiors, Crocker said he was of opinion that humanity and decency demanded that they be properly cared for, which, no one else attempting, he had determined to risk the consequences and discharge the duty himself. "How long have you been in the army?" asked the officer. 20 days was the reply. "I thought so," said the officer. The officer was so impressed with the young Yankee's bravery and compassion that not only did he allow him to continue his work, but even provided a cavalry escort to prevent further molestation and pointed out a boat that could be used to ferry the bodies across. Later, despite what amounted to just a fierce tongue-lashing by General Fitzjohn Porter, many stood with Captain Frank Donaldson, who wrote, "The daring of this man Crocker is beyond all precedent. Think of it, crossing the dam alone, exposed all the while to the sharpshooter's deadly aim, and why did they not fire upon him is beyond comprehension." Moreover, the regiment's surgeon, Joseph Thomas, then followed Crocker's unusual example, and heading towards the sound of the cries of the wounded, also led his medical assistants across the Potomac into Confederate-held territory, still with no flag of truce. This time, the Confederates agreed, but also conducted Dr. Thomas to a house in the rear, possibly the Osborne farm, to care for their wounded too. Many blackened bodies, their shoes taken and pockets turned inside out, were finally recovered under a truce on September 22nd. 40 were found on the field atop the bluffs. And like a very many, Joseph Ricketts arrived from Philadelphia to claim the body of his son, buried briefly in Sharpsburg Episcopal Churchyard. And with him began the long, timeless journey home.